I never thought my own son's wife would look me dead in the eye and call me just a burden. I never imagined she'd strip away every ounce of dignity I had left while my son stood there in silence, choosing her cruelty over his own mother's heart. But what neither of them knew was that I held the key to everything they wanted. And when they came crawling back, begging for my signature, the tables turned in ways they never saw coming. Get ready, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a masterclass in patience, power, and the sweetest kind of justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I'm 64 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family meant something. I believed that the sacrifices you make for your children would be remembered, that the love you pour into raising them would create an unbreakable bond. I spent 37 years as a devoted wife to my late husband Thomas, and 28 years as a mother to our son David. Every decision I made was filtered through one simple question: what's best for my family? When Thomas passed away from a sudden heart attack 2 years ago, I thought my world had ended. We'd been married since I was 19, and suddenly, at 62, I was learning how to exist as just Eleanor. Not Eleanor and Thomas, not David's mother and Thomas's wife, just me. The grief was suffocating, but I told myself I still had David. I still had my son, my pride and joy, the boy I'd raised to be kind, respectful, and loyal. David had always been my miracle child. We'd tried for years to have children, going through heartbreak after heartbreak until he finally came into our lives. I spoiled him, I'll admit that. Every soccer game, every school play, every scraped knee and broken heart, I was there. When he graduated from college, I cried harder than he did. When he got his first job at the engineering firm in Riverside Heights, I threw him a celebration dinner that lasted until midnight. And when he met Cassandra Vale at that company Christmas party 3 years ago, I was genuinely happy for him. He seemed smitten and she seemed nice enough. Cassandra was everything I wasn't. Where I was soft-spoken and traditional, she was bold and modern. Where I preferred quiet family dinners, she thrived in social settings with her real estate career connections. She had platinum blonde hair that always looked perfect, a wardrobe that cost more than my monthly expenses, and a smile that could light up a room when she wanted it to. At first, I thought our differences would complement each other. I thought she might teach me something about confidence, and maybe I could offer her the warmth of family she'd never really had, growing up as an only child with distant parents. I was wrong. The signs started small. During their engagement, Cassandra would make little comments about updating things. The family photos in David's apartment were too cluttered. The Christmas traditions we'd maintained for decades were outdated. My homemade gifts were sweet, but maybe we should focus on more practical things. David, blinded by love, went along with everything. When they got married last spring, I watched my son transform from the thoughtful boy I'd raised into someone who checked with his wife before making any decision, no matter how small. After Thomas died, the loneliness in our family home in Millbrook became unbearable. Every room echoed with memories. Every corner held fragments of a life that no longer existed. David suggested I sell the house and move somewhere smaller, more manageable. He said it with such concern, such genuine care, that I almost didn't notice Cassandra's satisfied smile in the background. "It's too much house for one person, Mom," he said, holding my hand. "You shouldn't have to maintain all this by yourself." So I sold it. The 4-bedroom colonial where I'd raised my son, where Thomas and I had planned to grow old together, where every Christmas morning had played out like a Norman Rockwell painting. I sold it and moved into a modest apartment on Oak Street, thinking this was just another sacrifice for family harmony. Cassandra had been very helpful in finding the place, she said. "Perfect for your needs," she'd chirped, though I noticed she never asked what those needs actually were. The apartment was fine, clean, safe, affordable, but it felt like living in a hotel room, sterile and temporary. I decorated with the few pieces I'd kept from the house, trying to make it feel like home, but everything seemed smaller, dimmer, less significant. Still, I told myself this was a new chapter. I was closer to David and Cassandra now, just a 15-minute drive away. We could have more family dinners, more time together. That's when I began to see who Cassandra really was. The first time she called me a burden, she thought I couldn't hear her. David had invited me for Sunday dinner, and I'd arrived a few minutes early. They were in the kitchen, and I was hanging up my coat when her voice carried through the hallway. "David, honey, I love that you want to take care of your mother, but she's becoming such a burden. Every weekend, every holiday, it's like we can't have our own life." I froze, my hand still on the coat hanger. David's response was too quiet to hear, but her laugh was crystal clear. "I'm not being mean, I'm being realistic. She calls you every other day, she expects us to include her in everything, and frankly, she's cramping our style. We're newlyweds, David, this should be our time." I stood there in their entryway, feeling smaller and more invisible than I'd ever felt in my life. This woman, who I'd welcomed into our family with open arms, who I'd helped plan a wedding for, who I'd tried so hard to connect with, saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle to her perfect life. But that was just the beginning. What came next would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and my own strength. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up needing you the most. And when that moment came, when Cassandra Vale stood in my living room with desperation in her eyes and a mortgage application in her hands, begging for the one thing only I could give her, well, that's when the real story began. Stay tuned, because you haven't seen anything yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me take you back to who I was before everything fell apart, because you need to understand what they destroyed to appreciate what I became. For 37 years, I was Eleanor Whitfield, devoted wife and mother. My world revolved around Thomas and David, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. Our life in Millbrook was everything I'd ever dreamed of. A white colonial house with blue shutters, a garden where I grew tomatoes and roses, and Sunday dinners that stretched late into the evening with laughter echoing through every room. Thomas worked as a senior accountant at Morrison & Associates downtown, steady and reliable as the sunrise. He'd leave every morning at 7:15 sharp, coffee in his travel mug, tie perfectly knotted, and he'd return every evening at 6:30 with stories about his day and always a small treat. Sometimes flowers from the corner shop, sometimes my favorite chocolate, once a book he thought I'd enjoy. We had routines, traditions, a rhythm that made our house feel like the safest place in the world. I was a stay-at-home mother by choice, something that seems almost old-fashioned now, but it was what I wanted. While other women my age were building careers, I was building a home. I volunteered at David's school, organized the annual church bake sale, and made sure our house was the one where all the neighborhood kids wanted to play. I took pride in knowing everyone's favorite meal, in remembering birthdays, in being the person people called when they needed help. David was our everything. After years of trying to conceive, multiple doctors telling us it might never happen, he arrived like a miracle on a snowy February morning. I held him in the hospital and made a promise that I would give him the kind of childhood where he'd never doubt he was loved, wanted, cherished. And I kept that promise. I was the mother who never missed a soccer game, even when it meant driving 40 minutes to away games in pouring rain. I was there for every school play, every science fair, every parent-teacher conference. When David struggled with math in middle school, I hired a tutor. When he wanted to learn guitar, I drove him to lessons twice a week for 3 years. When he got his heart broken by Jenny Matthews in 10th grade, I sat with him on his bedroom floor and let him cry without trying to fix everything with words. Thomas and I saved for his college education from the day he was born. We drove 15-year-old cars and took vacations at state parks instead of fancy resorts. But David graduated from State University debt-free with a degree in engineering. The day he walked across that stage, Thomas squeezed my hand and whispered, "We did good, Ellie. We did real good." Our house was the heart of everything. The kitchen table where we ate breakfast together every morning before school and work. The living room where we watched movies on Friday nights. David sprawled on the carpet with a bowl of popcorn. Thomas in his recliner and me on the couch with my knitting. The front porch where Thomas and I would sit in the evenings, watching David play with the neighbor kids, planning family vacations and dreaming about grandchildren someday. I had my routines and my people. Tuesday morning coffee with my friend Helen from church. Thursday afternoon volunteer work at the local library, reading to children during story time. Saturday grocery shopping at Palmer's Market, where everyone knew my name and asked about David's job and Thomas's golf game. I was woven into the fabric of Millbrook in a way that felt permanent, unshakable. When David brought Cassandra home for the first time, I was genuinely excited. He was 26, successful, and I'd started to worry he was too focused on work to find someone special. She walked into our kitchen in a designer dress and heels that clicked on the linoleum, and she was beautiful. The kind of beautiful that made other women feel invisible. But she smiled warmly, complimented my pot roast, and asked thoughtful questions about David's childhood. "He talks about you constantly," she told me as I served dessert. "It's clear you raised an amazing man." Thomas and I exchanged pleased glances. This woman understood what we'd built, what we'd given David. She seemed to appreciate the values we'd instilled in him. After they left that night, Thomas and I cleaned dishes together, both of us hopeful that our son had found someone worthy of the love we'd taught him to give. Over the next year, as their relationship grew serious, I tried to include Cassandra in our family traditions. I invited her to help with Thanksgiving dinner, taught her how to make David's favorite cookies, included her in our Christmas morning routine. She always participated, always smiled, always said the right things. But there were moments, small ones, when I caught glimpses of something else. The way she'd check her phone during family conversations. The subtle eye roll when I told stories about David's childhood. The time she reorganized my spice cabinet to be more efficient, without asking. The suggestions about updating our holiday traditions to be more sophisticated. Little things that individually meant nothing, but together created a pattern I was too hopeful to recognize. When Thomas had his heart attack, Cassandra was surprisingly supportive. She helped organize meals for the weeks following the funeral, sent beautiful flowers, and held David when he broke down at the viewing. I was grateful for her strength when I had none to offer. She seemed to understand that our family was fragile, that we needed to hold each other up during the worst time of our lives. But grief changes people, and I started to see changes in David that worried me. He became more distant, more focused on work, less interested in our weekly dinners. When I'd call to check in, Cassandra would often answer his phone, explaining that he was busy, but she'd pass along my message. Our conversations became shorter, more formal, filtered through her in ways that left me feeling disconnected from my own son. I told myself it was natural. He was building a life with the woman he loved, and I needed to give them space to grow together. I'd had my time as the most important woman in David's life, and now it was Cassandra's turn. That's what I told myself when he started canceling dinners, when he forgot to call on Sundays, when Christmas felt rushed and obligatory instead of warm and meaningful. I was proud of the life Thomas and I had built, the family we'd created, the love we'd nurtured. I believed in the foundation we'd laid, the values we'd instilled, the bond between mother and son that I thought could weather any storm. I was Eleanor Whitfield, and my identity was built on being needed, being valued, being the heart of my family. I had no idea that foundation was about to crumble, and that the woman I'd welcomed into our family with open arms was already planning to tear down everything I'd spent a lifetime building. But she had no idea what she was dealing with either. None of them did. Because sometimes the people who know you least are the ones who underestimate you most. And that would turn out to be their biggest mistake. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in October, and with him went everything I thought I knew about my life. He'd been complaining of chest tightness for a few days, but we both dismissed it as stress from the busy season at work. Thomas was only 61, healthy as far as we knew, still playing golf every Saturday with his college buddies. Heart attacks happened to other people's husbands, overweight men who smoked and ate bacon for breakfast. Not Thomas, who took his vitamins religiously and walked 3 miles every evening after dinner. I was in the kitchen making his lunch when I heard the crash upstairs. Not a normal sound, not something dropped or knocked over, but the heavy, final sound of a body hitting the floor. I knew immediately. In that terrible way, your soul recognizes catastrophe before your mind can process it. I found him collapsed in our bedroom, already gone. The paramedics said it was massive and instant, that he wouldn't have suffered. They meant it as comfort, but all I could think was that I hadn't been there. For 37 years, I'd been there for everything. Every fever, every celebration, every worried night when David was sick. And in the moment Thomas needed me most, I was downstairs making him a turkey sandwich he'd never eat. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, familiar faces speaking words that sounded like they were coming from underwater. David held me up during the service, literally and figuratively, his arm around my shoulders as I watched them lower the love of my life into the ground. Cassandra stood on his other side, appropriately somber in a black dress I'd never seen before, tissue ready for tears that never quite came. In the weeks that followed, the house became a museum of our life together. Thomas's coffee cup still sat in the sink because I couldn't bring myself to wash it. His reading glasses lay folded on the nightstand next to a book he'd never finish. His side of the closet remained exactly as he'd left it, shirts hanging in the order he preferred, cologne bottles arranged the way he liked them. People kept telling me I needed to take care of myself, but I didn't know what that meant anymore. Take care of which self? The Eleanor who made breakfast for 2 every morning out of habit? The Eleanor who still set the table for 2 and then stared at the empty chair across from me? The Eleanor who reached for the phone to call Thomas about something funny on the news, only to remember he wasn't there to answer? David came by every few days at first, bringing groceries I didn't ask for and staying for dinners that neither of us had the appetite to finish. He'd walk through the house like he was seeing it for the first time, picking up photographs and setting them down again, running his fingers along the mantel where Thomas's pipe still sat next to the wooden duck he'd carved for me on our 10th anniversary. "Mom, this place is too big for just you," he said one evening as we sat in the living room, the silence between us filled with everything we couldn't say. "All these rooms, all this upkeep. Dad wouldn't want you struggling with it alone." I looked around the room, at the couch where Thomas and I had watched the evening news together for decades, at the corner where our Christmas tree stood every December, at the window where I'd watched David learn to ride his bike in the driveway. "It's not too big," I said quietly. "It's home." But David had made up his mind, and I began to realize he wasn't making it alone. Cassandra had started joining these conversations, offering gentle suggestions about practical next steps and smart financial decisions. She'd researched retirement communities, senior-friendly apartments, places where I could start fresh and build a new life. She spoke about my future with the confident authority of someone who'd already planned it out. "Eleanor, I know this is hard," she said one afternoon, her manicured hand resting on my arm in what was supposed to be comfort. "But David and I just want what's best for you. Staying in this big house, maintaining all this space, paying these utility bills on one income, it's not sustainable. You need to think about your future, about what makes sense." What made sense to her was selling everything that connected me to my past and starting over in some sterile apartment where I could focus on healing without the burden of homeownership. What made sense to her was me becoming a smaller, more manageable version of myself, one that fit into her vision of what David's life should look like. The pressure was gentle but constant. Every conversation somehow circled back to the house, to my finances, to my situation. David would mention how worried he was about me living alone. Cassandra would bring up articles she'd read about seniors who'd downsized and found such freedom in simplicity. They tag-teamed my resistance with concern wrapped in logic, love disguised as practicality. I held out for 3 months. 3 months of rattling around in rooms that echoed, of cooking meals for one that I barely touched, of lying awake in a bed that felt infinite and empty. 3 months of David's worried phone calls, and Cassandra's helpful suggestions, and the growing realization that grief had made me a problem that needed to be solved. The final straw came during Thanksgiving. I'd insisted on hosting, desperate to maintain some thread of our family traditions. I spent 2 days preparing Thomas's favorite stuffing, the green bean casserole David had loved since childhood, the pumpkin pie recipe my mother had passed down to me. I set the table with our good china, lit candles, played the soft jazz Thomas always requested for holiday meals. David and Cassandra arrived precisely on time, bearing store-bought wine and what felt like forced smiles. Throughout dinner, I watched Cassandra's eyes catalog everything: the outdated wallpaper, the photographs crowding every surface, the way my hands shook slightly as I served the food. She made polite conversation about the meal, but I could see her calculating, planning, managing. After dessert, as I started clearing plates, she touched my arm. "Eleanor, let me help you with these dishes." "David, why don't you check that loose step on the front porch? We wouldn't want your mother to have an accident." It was the way she said your mother, not mom, not even Eleanor, but your mother, like I was a responsibility to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And the look that passed between them when she mentioned the loose step, the way David immediately knew what she was talking about, told me they'd been cataloging my home's flaws, building a case for why I couldn't stay. That night, after they left, I sat in Thomas's chair and finally cried. Not the dignified tears I'd shed at the funeral, but the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who'd finally realized they were completely alone. Thomas was gone, my home was being evaluated like a problem to be solved, and my son was letting his wife orchestrate my future without really asking what I wanted. But the worst part wasn't the grief or the loneliness. The worst part was the growing understanding that in Cassandra's world, there wasn't room for the woman I'd always been. She needed me to become someone smaller, quieter, less complicated. Someone who wouldn't interfere with the life she was building with my son. Within 2 weeks of that Thanksgiving dinner, I called the realtor. The house sold faster than anyone expected. Apparently, my 37 years of careful maintenance had created something other families dreamed of owning. I watched strangers walk through my kitchen, my living room, my garden, and see not my life but their potential future. They loved the built-in bookshelves Thomas had installed, the bay window where I'd read countless bedtime stories to David, the breakfast nook where our family had shared thousands of meals. The day I signed the papers, David squeezed my hand and said, "You're doing the right thing, Mom. Dad would be proud of how strong you're being." But I wasn't being strong, I was being erased, one room at a time, one memory at a time. And the woman who was helping to erase me stood behind my son, smiling the satisfied smile of someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted. I just didn't understand yet what she was planning to do with all that empty space where my life used to be. The apartment on Oak Street was supposed to be temporary. That's what David told me when he helped me move in, carrying box after box of my condensed life up 2 flights of narrow stairs. Just until you get back on your feet, Mom. Just until you figure out what you really want. What I really wanted was my husband back and my life returned to me, but since neither of those things were possible, I focused on making the small space feel like home. The 1-bedroom unit was clean and bright, with large windows that let in morning sun and a kitchenette that reminded me of my first apartment as a newlywed. I arranged my favorite photographs on the limited counter space, hung Thomas's landscape paintings on the white walls, and placed my mother's quilt on the narrow bed. Cassandra had been instrumental in finding the place, she reminded me frequently. She'd toured 6 different apartments, compared rent prices, even negotiated with the landlord to include utilities. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," she said, her arm around my shoulders as we stood in the empty living room on move-in day. "Somewhere safe and comfortable where you can start fresh." For the first few weeks, their attention felt like genuine care. David called every other day, checking to see if I needed anything from the store. Cassandra stopped by twice with housewarming gifts. a coffee maker for the tiny kitchen, a soft throw blanket for the couch, a small potted plant for the windowsill. They invited me for dinner every Sunday, maintaining at least one thread of our old family tradition. "See how much easier this is?" Cassandra would say as she walked through my apartment, straightening picture frames and adjusting curtains. "No yard work, no maintenance calls, no worrying about broken appliances. You can just focus on yourself now." I nodded and smiled because what else could I do? She was right that the apartment required less upkeep, but she missed the point entirely. I'd never seen yard work and home maintenance as burdens. They'd been expressions of love, ways of caring for the space where my family lived and grew. Now, with nothing to maintain and no one to care for, I felt purposeless, like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. But I was grateful. Or I told myself I was grateful. My son and daughter-in-law had helped me through the most difficult transition of my life, and I owed them my appreciation, not my complaints. When loneliness crept in during the long afternoons, I reminded myself that this was growth, that learning to live independently was a necessary part of healing from loss. Their support came with guidelines, though I didn't recognize them as such at first. Cassandra gently suggested that calling David every day might be overwhelming for him as he tried to balance work and marriage. She recommended I find hobbies, maybe join a book club at the library or take up watercolor painting. "You have so much time now," she said with bright enthusiasm. "You could discover talents you never knew you had." When I mentioned feeling isolated, she provided solutions that felt helpful but somehow made me feel more alone. She researched senior groups in the area, printed out schedules for community center activities, even offered to drive me to a few events. But every suggestion felt designed to keep me busy rather than connected, occupied rather than included. The Sunday dinners became my lifeline, the one guaranteed time each week when I felt like part of a family again. I'd arrive at their modern townhouse in Riverside Heights with a homemade dessert, David's favorite chocolate chip cookies, or the lemon bars Cassandra claimed to love, and spend 3 hours pretending everything was normal. David would update me on his work projects, I'd share stories about my week, and Cassandra would discuss her latest real estate deals with animated excitement. Their home was everything mine had never been: sleek, minimalist, decorated in grays and whites that looked expensive and felt cold. Every surface was clear, every piece of furniture deliberately chosen for its aesthetic rather than its comfort. The refrigerator had no magnets holding up grandchildren's drawings because there were no grandchildren yet. The walls displayed abstract art instead of family photos. It was beautiful in the way magazine pages are beautiful, perfect and untouchable. I tried to fit into their world, to appreciate the sophisticated dinners Cassandra prepared and the wine pairings she'd researched. I complimented her decorating choices and asked interested questions about David's engineering projects. I was careful not to mention Thomas too often, not to dwell on memories that might make them uncomfortable, not to seem like I was living in the past. But I was living in the past, because the present felt hollow and the future looked impossible to imagine. In my small apartment, surrounded by remnants of a life that no longer existed, I spent hours each day, simply remembering. I'd hold Thomas's coffee mug and recall the sound of his laughter. I'd flip through photo albums and see David at every age, reminding myself that I'd once been essential to someone's happiness. The phone calls from David became less frequent. When I'd call him, Cassandra often answered, explaining that he was in the shower or on a work call or just stepping out. She'd chat pleasantly for a few minutes, asking about my health and my activities. But the conversations felt like polite small talk rather than family connection. "I'll tell him you called," she'd promise, and sometimes he'd call back, sometimes he wouldn't. I started keeping a journal of our conversations, not because I didn't trust my memory, but because I needed proof that we were still in contact. The entries grew shorter and less frequent. "Called David. C said he's busy with new project. We'll call back later. Left message about doctor appointment. No response yet. Invited them for coffee this weekend. C said they have plans." When I did see David in person, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone or glancing at Cassandra for cues about how to respond to my questions. The easy conversation we'd always shared felt strained, like we were both reading from scripts written by someone else. He'd ask about my health, my apartment, my activities, but in the polite way you'd inquire about a distant relative's welfare, not with the genuine interest of a son who truly wanted to know. Cassandra filled the silences, directing conversations towards safe topics and steering us away from anything that might lead to emotional territory. When I mentioned missing the garden Thomas and I had tended together, she'd quickly pivot to suggesting I look into the community garden program downtown. When I talked about feeling disconnected from my old neighborhood friends, she'd remind me that making new friends was part of starting fresh. Every suggestion was practical, every solution was logical, and every response made me feel like my feelings were problems to be solved rather than experiences to be shared. I began to understand that in their world, grief had an expiration date, and I was exceeding it. The breaking point came during a dinner in early spring. I'd made David's favorite pot roast, hoping to surprise them with comfort food that might spark some warmth in their sterile dining room. As I served the meal, talking about the recipe Thomas had helped me perfect over the years, I noticed Cassandra's expression growing tighter with each memory I shared. "Eleanor," she finally interrupted, her voice gentle but firm, "maybe it would be healthier if you focused on making new memories instead of always looking backward. David and I worry that you're getting stuck in the past." David nodded in agreement, and I felt something crack inside my chest. They weren't just managing my present, they were trying to edit my past, to decide which memories were appropriate for me to keep, and which ones I needed to release for their comfort. That night, lying in my narrow bed in my temporary apartment that was becoming increasingly permanent, I realized that their kindness had borders, their support had conditions, and their love had limits I was apparently approaching. I was supposed to be grateful for their help while requiring as little help as possible. I was supposed to be family while taking up as little space as possible in their actual lives. But I still believed this was temporary. I still believed that love would win, that family bonds would prove stronger than inconvenience, that the son I'd raised would remember the mother who'd raised him. I still believed that Cassandra's management of my life came from a place of caring, even if it felt increasingly like control. I had no idea that what I was experiencing wasn't the adjustment period before acceptance. It was the setup before abandonment. And the woman who'd so helpfully found me this perfect apartment was already planning my exit from it. The invitation came on a Thursday afternoon in late April, and I should have known something was wrong by how formal it sounded. Cassandra called instead of David, which had become more common lately, but her tone was different, businesslike, almost rehearsed. "Eleanor, we'd love to have you over for dinner this Sunday. There are some things David and I need to discuss with you, some exciting news we want to share." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Would 6 o'clock work for you?" I said yes immediately, grateful for the invitation and curious about their news. Maybe they were finally ready to start a family, maybe David had gotten a promotion. Maybe they'd realized how much they missed our regular Sunday dinners and wanted to return to that tradition. I spent the weekend planning what to wear, what dessert to bring, how to respond enthusiastically to whatever good news they wanted to share. I arrived at their townhouse precisely at 6, carrying a homemade apple pie and wearing the blue dress David had always said brought out my eyes. Cassandra answered the door in a crisp white blouse and dark slacks that made her look like she was dressed for a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Her smile was bright but didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, perfect timing, come in, come in. David's just finishing up some work in his office, but he'll be right out." The dining room table was set more formally than usual, with cloth napkins and the good china they typically reserve for holidays. A manila folder sat prominently next to David's place setting, and I noticed several documents spread across the kitchen counter. Whatever they wanted to discuss, they'd been preparing for it. David emerged from his office wearing a tie, which seemed odd for a Sunday dinner at home. He hugged me, but it felt perfunctory, like he was going through motions rather than expressing genuine affection. Throughout the meal, salmon with some kind of sauce I couldn't identify, asparagus that had been arranged rather than simply served, wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The conversation felt stilted and strange. They asked about my health, my activities, whether I was settling in well to apartment living. Cassandra mentioned that she'd driven past my building recently and noticed how convenient everything was, how I could walk to the grocery store and the pharmacy. David nodded along, but he seemed nervous, checking his watch frequently and glancing at that manila folder like it contained something that might bite him. "The pie is delicious, Mom," he said as Cassandra served dessert. "You always made the best apple pie." The past tense hit me like a slap. Not "you make the best apple pie," but "you made." Like my pie-making days were behind me, like I was already a memory they were preserving, rather than a presence they were enjoying. After dessert, Cassandra stood and began clearing plates with unusual efficiency. "Eleanor, why don't you and David go sit in the living room? I'll just clean up here and then join you. David has something he wants to show you." In the living room, David sat on the edge of the couch, that manila folder in his hands, looking like a man about to deliver news he didn't want to share. I settled into the chair across from him, the same chair I'd sat in for dozens of Sunday dinners, but tonight it felt like I was being positioned for something rather than welcomed into something. "Mom," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair the way he'd done since childhood when he was nervous. "Mom, Cassandra and I have been talking, and we think we've found a solution to some of the challenges you've been facing." Challenges? I wanted to ask what challenges he meant, but something in his tone warned me to stay quiet and listen. "We know the apartment has been an adjustment, and we know you've been feeling a little isolated, a little uncertain about the future." He opened the folder and pulled out a glossy brochure. "So we did some research, and we found this place." He handed me the brochure, Sunset Manor, Premier Senior Living Community. The cover showed smiling elderly people playing cards, tending a garden, participating in what looked like a group exercise class. Everyone looked content, engaged, surrounded by friends their own age. "It's about 40 minutes from here," David continued, his words coming faster now, like he wanted to get through them before I could interrupt. "They have studio apartments, all meals included, planned activities, transportation to medical appointments. There's even a library and a chapel. You'd have everything you need, and you'd be around people who understand what you're going through." I stared at the brochure, my hands beginning to shake. "David, I don't understand. I have an apartment. I have everything I need." Cassandra entered the room at that moment, moving to stand behind David's chair with her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support. "Eleanor, we've been watching you struggle, and it breaks our hearts. You're lonely, you're isolated, and frankly, you're not thriving the way someone your age should be." "Someone my age?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "You're 64 years old," she continued, her voice taking on the patient tone people use with children or people they consider incapable of understanding complex concepts. "You should be enjoying your golden years, not sitting alone in an apartment, dwelling on the past. This place would give you community, purpose, activities designed for people in your stage of life." David pulled out more papers from the folder. "We've already filled out the application," he said, not meeting my eyes. "There's a waiting list, but they think they'll have an opening in the next few months. We just need you to sign a few forms, and we can get the process started." I looked at the papers: medical history forms, financial disclosure documents, emergency contact information already filled in with David and Cassandra's names. They'd planned this entire conversation, researched the facility, completed the paperwork, made decisions about my future without involving me in any of it. "You want to put me in a nursing home?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not a nursing home," Cassandra said quickly. "It's an independent living community. You'd have your own apartment, your own space. You'd just also have support when you need it, and people your own age to socialize with." "People my own age," I repeated. instead of my family. David leaned forward, finally looking directly at me. Mom, we're not abandoning you. We'll visit. We'll call. But right now, we're worried about you. You're not making friends. You're not engaging with life. You're not moving forward. And honestly, he glanced at Cassandra, who nodded encouragingly. Honestly, it's affecting our marriage. The room went silent except for the tick of their expensive wall clock. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, could feel something fundamental shifting inside my chest, like a foundation cracking under pressure it was never designed to bear. Affecting your marriage, how? I asked. Cassandra spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. David worries about you constantly. He calls you every few days. He drives over to check on you. He lies awake at night, wondering if you're okay. We can't start our own family. We can't plan for our future because we're always managing your present. Managing my present. I set the brochure down on the coffee table, my hands steady now despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. Is that what you've been doing? We've been taking care of you, David said, and for the first time I heard defensiveness in his voice. Since Dad died, we've been making sure you're okay, making sure you have what you need. But Mom, we can't be your whole world. We can't be responsible for your happiness. I looked at my son, this man I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years, loved unconditionally for 28, and saw a stranger. Not because he'd changed, but because I was finally seeing him clearly. He wasn't the boy who'd run to me with scraped knees and broken hearts. He was a man who decided I was a problem to be solved, a burden to be managed, an obstacle to the life he wanted to build with his wife. You're right, I said quietly. You can't be responsible for my happiness, but I never asked you to be. Mom, I asked for Sunday dinners. I asked for phone calls. I asked to remain part of the family I spent my entire adult life building. I stood up, leaving the brochure and papers scattered on their expensive coffee table. I never asked you to manage my present, or plan my future, or decide what stage of life I'm in. Cassandra's carefully composed expression flickered. Eleanor, we're trying to help you. This facility has everything you could want. Except my family, I interrupted. Except my son. Except the life I'm apparently no longer allowed to live because it inconveniences yours. I walked toward the door, and David jumped up to follow me. Mom, please. Don't leave like this. We can talk about other options, other solutions. I turned back to look at him one more time. Other solutions to what problem, David? The problem of having a mother who loves you? The problem of having family obligations? The problem of remembering where you came from? He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Behind him, Cassandra stood with her arms crossed, her face wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd gotten exactly what she wanted. Don't call me, I said as I opened their front door. Don't come by my apartment. Don't pretend this was about helping me when it was really about getting rid of me. I walked to my car in the gathering dusk, got behind the wheel, and drove home to my temporary apartment that was about to become my permanent prison. Because now I understood the truth. I wasn't family anymore. I was a project they'd completed, a problem they'd solved, a burden they were finally ready to transfer to professionals who were paid to care. The son I'd raised to be loyal had chosen loyalty to his wife over loyalty to his mother. The daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into our family had decided there wasn't room for the woman who'd built that family in the first place. And I was supposed to be grateful for their solution, supposed to sign papers committing myself to exile so they could get on with their lives unencumbered by mine. But as I sat in my car, outside my apartment building, hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died: anger. Pure, clean, clarifying rage at being dismissed, diminished, and discarded by people who owed their very existence to my love. They thought they found the perfect solution to the problem of Eleanor Whitfield. They had no idea they'd just created a much bigger problem than the one they were trying to solve. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the comfortable quiet of a house at rest, or the peaceful hush of early morning, but the hollow, echoing silence of complete abandonment. For the first time in my adult life, no one was calling to check on me. No one was expecting me anywhere. No one was planning their day around my existence. The first week after that devastating Sunday dinner, I kept waiting for the phone to ring. Surely David would call to apologize, to explain that he'd been pressured into something he didn't really mean. Surely he'd realize that shipping his mother off to a senior facility wasn't the solution to whatever problems he thought existed in his marriage. But the phone sat silent on my kitchen counter, as accusatory as an unpaid bill. I found myself checking my voicemail obsessively, even though I'd heard it ring 0 times. I'd pick up the handset just to make sure it was working, dial the time and temperature number just to hear another human voice say something, anything, to break the oppressive quiet of my small apartment. The busy sounds of my neighbors, footsteps in the hallway, muffled television shows, occasional conversations through thin walls, only made my own silence more profound. By the second week, I stopped checking my phone. By the third, I stopped hoping it would ring. The grocery shopping became an exercise in careful timing. I'd wait until I was sure David would be at work before venturing out, terrified of running into him at the store where we'd shopped together for years. The first time I saw his car in the parking lot, I sat in my own vehicle for 20 minutes, heart racing, before driving home with my shopping list unfulfilled. I learned to shop at different stores, at odd hours, like a criminal avoiding detection. My weekly routines, which had provided structure during the early months of grief, now felt like endless expanses of time I needed to fill somehow. Tuesday morning coffee with Helen had ended months ago when she moved to Florida to live with her daughter. Thursday volunteer work at the library had stopped feeling meaningful when I realized I was reading to children who would go home to families that wanted them around. Saturday grocery shopping had become a covert operation designed to avoid my own son. I tried to establish new routines, to follow Cassandra's well-meaning advice about discovering hobbies and making friends. I attended a book club at the community center, but the women there already had established friendships and inside jokes I'd never be part of. I signed up for a watercolor class, but my shaking hands produced muddy landscapes that looked like a child's finger paintings. I joined a walking group for seniors, but listening to other women complain about their children not calling enough felt like salt in wounds that hadn't even begun to heal. The worst part wasn't the activities that didn't work. It was the constant reminder that I was starting over at 64, trying to build a life from scratch when most people my age were deepening existing relationships and enjoying the fruits of lifelong connections. Every introduction began with the same questions. Did I have children? Was I married? Where had I lived before? The answers: yes. One son, widowed, sold my family home, inevitably led to sympathetic nods and careful subject changes that made it clear I was the kind of cautionary tale people preferred not to examine too closely. The evenings were the worst. During the day, I could at least pretend to be busy, could run errands, or sit in the park or walk through the mall just to be around other people. But when darkness fell, and the world settled into family dinners, and homework help, and the intimate routines of people who belonged to each other, my aloneness became inescapable. I started eating dinner standing at my kitchen counter, because sitting at my small table for one felt too much like admitting this was my permanent reality. I'd heat up a can of soup, or make a sandwich and consume it quickly, mechanically, like fuel rather than a meal. The act of cooking, which had once been an expression of love for my family, now seemed pointless and sad when the only person benefiting was me. Television became my constant companion, not because I enjoyed the programs, but because the voices filled the silence. I'd fall asleep on the couch with the TV on, wake up at 3 in the morning to infomercials selling products for problems I didn't have, and drag myself to bed feeling more tired than when I'd started. My sleep patterns dissolved into irregular naps and long stretches of staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, and wondering what I could have done differently. The mail brought a cruel reminder every few days of the life I'd lost. Address labels still arrived for, quote, Thomas and Eleanor Whitfield, credit card offers addressed to my deceased husband, magazine subscriptions that would outlive us both. I'd started saving Thomas's mail in a shoebox, unable to throw it away, but equally unable to call the companies and explain that he was dead, because that conversation always led to the question of whether there was another family member who could handle his accounts, and the answer, yes, but he's decided I'm too much trouble, was too humiliating to speak aloud. Money became a constant worry for the first time in my adult life. Thomas's pension provided enough for my basic needs, but I hadn't realized how much of our financial security had depended on 2 Social Security checks, 2 sets of benefits, the shared expenses of a couple. My rent alone consumed nearly half my monthly income, leaving little room for the small luxuries that might have made solitude more bearable. I clipped coupons like my mother had during the Depression, bought generic brands, and calculated the cost of every purchase with the grim attention of someone who'd realized that financial independence was an illusion I could no longer afford. The isolation began affecting my mind in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd find myself having entire conversations with Thomas, updating him on my day as if he were sitting in his chair reading the newspaper. I'd set 2 places at the table out of habit, then feel foolish and angry at my own confusion. Sometimes I'd hear his voice calling my name from the bedroom, and I'd respond before remembering he wasn't there to have called me. Worse than the conversations with my dead husband were the imaginary arguments with my living son. I'd rehearse confrontations that would never happen, perfect responses to accusations that would never be made, prepare defenses for attacks that existed only in my own mind. I'd stand in my bathroom mirror and practice telling David exactly what I thought of his betrayal, his cowardice, his willingness to sacrifice his mother for his wife's comfort. But these speeches only made me feel more powerless, because they highlighted how little opportunity I'd have to deliver them. The physical effects of isolation surprised me. My appetite disappeared almost entirely, and I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. My hair grew thin and limp, and I stopped bothering with makeup or nice clothes because no one would see me anyway. My posture curved inward, as if my body was protecting itself from blows that never came. I moved through my days like a ghost haunting her own life, present but not really there, visible but not really seen. Spring turned to summer, and I watched from my apartment window as families in the courtyard below barbecued together. Children played on the small playground. Couples walked hand in hand toward the evening. I became an expert on my neighbors' lives. The young mother who struggled to get her toddler's stroller down the stairs. The elderly man who sat on his balcony every evening reading what looked like the same book. The college students who played music too loud and laughed too much, and reminded me of what it felt like to believe the future held infinite possibilities. I envied them all, even the ones who seemed to have problems. At least their problems were witnessed, shared, considered worthy of other people's attention. My problems existed in a vacuum, unobserved, and therefore somehow less real, less deserving of sympathy or solutions. By midsummer, I'd stopped pretending this isolation was temporary. I'd stopped believing that David would change his mind, that Cassandra would develop empathy, that family bonds would prove stronger than convenience. I'd stopped hoping for reconciliation and started accepting that this small apartment, this quiet life, this careful existence designed to disturb no one, was what remained of Eleanor Whitfield. But acceptance and surrender are 2 different things, and I hadn't surrendered yet. I just didn't know the difference until the day I discovered that sometimes the very people who throw you away are the ones who end up needing what they discarded most. The envelope arrived on a sweltering Tuesday in August, mixed in with the usual assortment of bills and advertisements that made up my daily mail. I almost threw it away without opening it. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize, Morrison, Blake & Associates, and I assumed it was another attempt to sell me legal services I couldn't afford. But something about the formal letterhead, the way my name was typed in full, rather than printed from a mailing list, made me pause. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper and a business card. The letter was brief, professional, and completely bewildering. Dear Mrs. Whitfield, I am writing regarding the estate of Thomas Whitfield and certain documents that have come to my attention. I believe you may have information that could be relevant to a property matter my firm is handling. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss this confidential matter. Sincerely, James Morrison, Senior Partner. I read the letter 3 times, my confusion growing with each reading. Thomas had been gone for almost 2 years. His estate had been settled months ago, a straightforward process since we'd owned everything jointly and I was his sole beneficiary. There had been no complications, no outstanding debts, no hidden assets. What property matter could possibly involve my late husband now? I set the letter aside for 2 days, afraid it might be some kind of scam designed to prey on confused widows. But the lawyer's name haunted me, and finally, I called the number on the business card. The receptionist who answered was professional and kind, and she put me through to Mr. Morrison immediately. Mrs. Whitfield, thank you for calling, he said, his voice warm but cautious. I apologize for the mysterious nature of my letter, but I needed to speak with you directly about a rather unusual situation. Would it be possible for you to come to my office? There are some documents I'd like you to see, and this conversation would be better had in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him the following afternoon. His office was in a gleaming high-rise downtown, the kind of building where important people made important decisions. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending into a world I didn't belong in, but Mr. Morrison himself was surprisingly down to earth, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the patient manner of someone accustomed to delivering complicated news. Mrs. Whitfield, what I'm about to show you may come as quite a shock, he said, gesturing for me to sit in a leather chair across from his mahogany desk. 6 months ago, my firm was contacted by the estate of Harold Brennan. Are you familiar with that name? I shook my head. Harold Brennan meant nothing to me. Mr. Brennan was a real estate developer here in the city. He passed away last spring, and his estate is finally being settled. Among his papers, we found this. He handed me a manila folder. I think you should read it before we discuss what it means. Inside the folder was a typed document dated 15 years earlier, along with what appeared to be property deeds and bank statements. But it was the cover letter that made my hands start shaking. To be delivered to Eleanor Whitfield in the event of my death. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my longtime secret can finally be revealed. I am your biological father. Your mother, Sarah, and I had a relationship that lasted several years when you were young. She never told you the truth because I was married and had a family I couldn't leave. But I never stopped caring about what happened to you, and I never stopped feeling responsible for the life you deserved but never had the chance to claim. The letter continued, but I couldn't focus on the words. The room seemed to tilt around me, and Mr. Morrison's voice became distant as he asked if I needed water, if I was all right, if I wanted him to continue. My mother, Sarah Murphy, that was her maiden name, had died when I was 30, taking whatever secrets she'd held to her grave, or so I'd thought. Mrs. Whitfield? Mr. Morrison's voice brought me back to the present. Should I continue reading the letter to you? I nodded, incapable of speech. I know this information comes too late to change your childhood or give you the father you deserved, he read, but it's not too late to give you the security I always wanted to provide. I have been following your life from a distance, and I know you married a good man and raised a fine son. I know you've been happy, and that knowledge has been the only peace I've found regarding this situation. But I also know that happiness can be fragile, and security can disappear overnight, so I have made arrangements. Mr. Morrison paused, looking at me over his reading glasses. Mrs. Whitfield, are you ready to hear about these arrangements? I managed to whisper yes. Upon my death, ownership of the property at 847 Riverside Heights Boulevard will transfer to you. This building contains 12 residential units and generates significant rental income. Additionally, an account has been established in your name containing sufficient funds to maintain the property and provide for your future security. You will find all necessary documentation with this letter. I cannot give you a father's love, Eleanor, but I can give you a father's protection. Use this gift wisely, and know that you are never forgotten." The silence in the office stretched between us, like a chasm. Mr. Morrison set the letter down gently and pulled out additional documents: property deeds, bank statements, rental agreements. The numbers swam before my eyes, but one address burned itself into my brain: 847 Riverside Heights Boulevard. "Mr. Morrison," I said slowly, "that address, is that in the Riverside Heights neighborhood?" "Yes, it's a very desirable area. High-end rental properties, excellent location. Why do you ask?" My mouth went dry. "My son lives in that neighborhood. He and his wife, they rent a townhouse somewhere on Riverside Heights Boulevard." Mr. Morrison's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine concern. "Mrs. Whitfield, perhaps you should look at the tenant list." He handed me another document. "The property consists of townhouses, each renting for approximately $4,000 per month." I scanned the list of names, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And there it was, halfway down the page. Unit 847C, David and Cassandra Whitfield. Monthly rent, $4,200. Lease expires December 31st. The room spun around me. My son, the son who'd decided I was too much of a burden to keep in his life, who'd tried to ship me off to a senior facility so I wouldn't interfere with his marriage, was living in a townhouse that I now owned. The daughter-in-law who'd orchestrated my exile, who'd convinced my son that his mother was an obstacle to their happiness, was paying rent to me without knowing it. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you all right?" Mr. Morrison was standing now, looking genuinely worried. "They don't know," I whispered. "They have no idea." "Know what?" "That I'm their landlord." I looked up at him, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness or despair. I felt power. "Mr. Morrison, what exactly does it mean to own this property? What rights do I have as the landlord?" He sat back down, his expression careful. "Well, you have the right to collect rent, obviously. You can make decisions about lease renewals, about property improvements, about rental rates when leases expire. You're responsible for maintenance and repairs, but you also have significant control over who lives there and under what terms." "And their lease expires at the end of December?" "Yes, that's correct. All the current leases were signed on one-year terms that expire December 31st. As the new owner, you'll need to decide whether to offer renewals and at what rental rates." I stared at the documents spread across his desk, proof of a father I'd never known, evidence of a love I'd never felt, and power I'd never imagined possessing. Harold Brennan had been absent from my life, but he'd been watching from the shadows, making arrangements for a future he wouldn't live to see. "There's one more thing," Mr. Morrison said, pulling out a final envelope. "Mr. Brennan left specific instructions that you should receive this letter personally, after you'd had time to process the property transfer." The second letter was handwritten, the penmanship shaky but determined. "Eleanor, I know you must be shocked and probably angry that I waited until death to acknowledge you. I was a coward in life, but I hope I can be brave in death. I followed your story from afar, your marriage, your son's birth, your husband's career. You built a beautiful life without my help, and I was proud of you, even though I had no right to be. But I also worried. I worried about what would happen when you were older, when you needed support, when the people you devoted your life to might not prove as devoted in return. I hope I was wrong to worry. I hope your family treasures you as much as you deserve to be treasured. But if they don't, if you ever find yourself alone and forgotten, remember that you are Harold Brennan's daughter, and Brennans don't stay down when they're knocked down. We get up, we dust ourselves off, and we show the world what we're really made of. The property is yours to do with as you see fit. Use it wisely, use it powerfully. Use it to remind anyone who's forgotten your worth exactly who Eleanor Whitfield really is." I sat in that leather chair in that expensive office, holding letters from a father I'd never known, surrounded by documents that proved I owned the home of the son who'd abandoned me. And for the first time since Thomas died, for the first time since David chose his wife over his mother, for the first time since I'd been dismissed as just a burden, I smiled. Not a sad smile or a bitter smile, but the smile of a woman who'd just discovered she wasn't powerless after all. The smile of someone who'd been underestimated by people who were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the consequences of throwing away something they didn't understand the value of. David and Cassandra had made their choice about what kind of family they wanted to be. Now I was going to show them exactly what kind of landlord their choice had earned them. The drive home from Mr. Morrison's office felt like traveling between two different worlds. When I'd left my apartment that morning, I was Eleanor Whitfield, the discarded mother living on a fixed income in a one-bedroom apartment, carefully budgeting every grocery store purchase and avoiding places where I might accidentally encounter the son who no longer wanted me in his life. But the woman who parked outside that same apartment building 3 hours later was someone entirely different. I sat in my car for a long time, the manila folder containing my new reality spread across the passenger seat. Property deeds, bank statements, rental agreements, documents that proved I wasn't the powerless woman David and Cassandra had dismissed. I wasn't just Eleanor Whitfield anymore. I was Eleanor Brennan Whitfield, daughter of a man who'd built an empire from nothing and left me a piece of it to wield as I saw fit. The bank account Harold Brennan had established contained more money than I'd seen in my entire life. Not enough to be considered wealthy by some standards, but more than enough to change everything about how I moved through the world. More than enough to stop clipping coupons and buying generic brands. More than enough to stop worrying about whether I could afford a taxi to medical appointments, or a new winter coat when the seasons changed. But the money wasn't the real power. The real power was that my son and his wife were living in my property, paying me rent every month without knowing it, making decisions about their future that I now controlled. The lease that would expire in 4 months wasn't just a contract. It was a deadline, a timeline for justice, a countdown to the moment when they'd discover exactly who they'd been paying their monthly $4,200 to all along. I climbed the stairs to my apartment slowly, my mind racing with possibilities. Inside, I spread the documents across my small kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten lonely dinners for months, where I'd sat staring at my silent phone, where I'd opened bills and calculated whether I could afford small luxuries like fresh flowers or a magazine subscription. Now that table held proof that I owned property worth more than most people's annual salaries. The first thing I did was call the property management company that had been handling the building for Harold Brennan. I needed to understand exactly what I'd inherited, what responsibilities came with ownership, and what rights I had as a landlord. The conversation with Mrs. Patricia Kelly, the lead property manager, was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. "Mrs. Whitfield, we're so pleased to finally meet the new owner," she said when I reached her by phone. "Mr. Brennan spoke of you often. He was very specific about his wishes for the property and for your transition into ownership." "He spoke of me?" I asked, still struggling to believe this man had thought about me at all. "Oh yes, frequently. He was quite proud of you, you know. He'd show us newspaper clippings when your son graduated from college, when he got married. He kept track of the important moments in your life even though he couldn't be part of them." The idea that a stranger, no, not a stranger, my father, had been collecting newspaper clippings about my family's milestones while I remained completely unaware of his existence was almost too much to process. But Mrs. Kelly was continuing with practical information I needed to hear. "The property generates approximately $50,000 per month in rental income," she explained. "After maintenance costs, property taxes, and our management fee, you're looking at a net monthly income of roughly $38,000. Mr. Brennan left detailed instructions about property improvements he wanted made. And there's a separate account specifically for those upgrades. $38,000 per month. I'd been living on less than $3,000. The number was so large, it felt abstract, like play money in a board game rather than real income I could depend on. But Mrs. Kelly was already moving on to more immediate concerns. There are a few maintenance issues we've been waiting to address until ownership transferred, she continued, and several leases expire at the end of the year. Mr. Brennan left specific instructions that you should handle all renewal decisions personally. He wanted you to have complete control over who continues living in the property. Complete control over who lived in Harold Brennan's, no, my, property. Over whether leases got renewed or expired. Over what happened to tenants who'd perhaps forgotten that being a good tenant meant more than just paying rent on time. Mrs. Kelly, I said carefully, what can you tell me about the current tenants? Are there any concerns, any problems, anyone who might not be suitable for lease renewal? She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. Well, most of our tenants are excellent. Quiet, respectful, no complaints from neighbors. But there is one unit that's been generating some concerns lately. My heart began to race. Which unit? 847C, the Whitfields. They've been very demanding lately, constantly calling with complaints about things that aren't actually problems. Last month, Mr. David Whitfield called 6 times about the air conditioning, insisting it wasn't working properly. Our maintenance team checked it 3 times and found nothing wrong. The week before that, Mrs. Cassandra Whitfield demanded we repaint their entire unit because she claimed the color was, quote, affecting her mental health. When we explained that cosmetic changes aren't covered by their lease, she became quite hostile. I closed my eyes, imagining Cassandra's perfectly manicured voice demanding special treatment, David's entitled assumption that the world should bend to accommodate his wife's preferences. They'd been treating my property, my inheritance, like their personal service staff. Has there been anything else? I asked. Unfortunately, yes. They've been complaining to other tenants about the management company, trying to organize some kind of group action about rental rates. Mrs. Whitfield seems to believe the rent is too high for what they're getting, despite living in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. She's been quite vocal about her dissatisfaction. Cassandra thought the rent was too high. The same woman who decided I was too expensive to keep around was complaining about paying rent to support herself. The irony was so perfect it took my breath away. Mrs. Kelly, what would you recommend regarding their lease renewal? Honestly, I'd recommend non-renewal. They're disruptive, demanding, and they don't seem to appreciate the quality of the property they're renting. We have a waiting list of potential tenants who would be grateful for the opportunity to live there and wouldn't constantly complain about problems that don't exist. After hanging up with Mrs. Kelly, I sat at my kitchen table and began planning, not revenge. I kept telling myself it wasn't revenge, but justice. A correction of the natural order that had been disrupted when my own family decided I was disposable. I spent the next 3 days educating myself about landlord rights and responsibilities. I read every word of David and Cassandra's lease agreement, learning about notice requirements and renewal procedures. I researched rental rates in the Riverside Heights area and discovered that similar properties were renting for significantly more than what my tenants were currently paying. Harold Brennan had been generous with his rental rates, probably more generous than market conditions warranted. By the weekend, I'd developed a comprehensive understanding of my position. I owned a valuable property in a desirable neighborhood. I had excellent tenants in 11 of the 12 units. And I had 1 unit occupied by people who not only failed to appreciate what they had, but had actively worked to remove the woman who now controlled their housing situation from their lives. On Sunday morning, exactly 4 months to the day since David and Cassandra had presented me with brochures for senior living facilities, I called Mrs. Kelly back. I've made my decision about the lease renewals, I told her. I'd like to send non-renewal notices to the tenants in Unit 847C. What's the required notice period? 60 days before the lease expiration date, she replied. So we'd need to send the notice by October 31st at the latest. Perfect, I said, marking the date on my calendar with a red pen. And Mrs. Kelly, I'd like to handle this notification personally. I want to deliver the news myself. That's unusual, but certainly within your rights as the property owner. Should I prepare the standard non-renewal documentation? Yes, but I'll want to review everything before it's sent. I want to make sure the language is exactly right. After ending the call, I walked to my bathroom mirror and looked at myself, really looked. For the first time in months, the woman staring back at me was thin, pale, defeated-looking. Her hair was limp, her posture curved inward, her eyes hollow with grief and abandonment. She looked like someone who'd given up, someone who'd accepted being discarded as the natural order of things. But that woman was gone. In her place stood Eleanor Whitfield, daughter of a real estate empire, owner of property worth millions, landlord to the son who decided she wasn't worth the trouble of loving. I made appointments for the following week: hair salon, doctor for a general checkup, dentist for the cleaning I'd been postponing, shopping for clothes that fit the woman I was becoming rather than the woman I'd been. I opened new bank accounts and transferred funds. I researched financial advisors and legal counsel. I began building the infrastructure of power. Most importantly, I began planning for October 31st, the day I would knock on the door of Unit 847C and remind David and Cassandra Whitfield that some burdens are more powerful than the people who try to discard them. The countdown had begun, and this time I wasn't the one who'd be left standing outside in the cold. October arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. I woke each morning with purpose now, something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. But this wasn't the gentle purpose of a woman tending to her family's needs. This was the sharp, focused purpose of someone who'd been underestimated and was about to prove exactly how costly that mistake could be. My transformation over the past 6 weeks had been methodical and deliberate. The hairdresser had cut away months of neglect, shaping my gray hair into a sleek bob that made me look confident rather than forgotten. The doctor had prescribed vitamins and a low-dose antidepressant that lifted the fog I hadn't even realized was clouding my thinking. The shopping trips had replaced my worn, shapeless clothes with pieces that fit properly and conveyed authority. Blazers with structured shoulders, slacks that didn't sag, shoes that clicked decisively against concrete. But the most important changes weren't visible. I'd spent hours studying property law, tenant rights, and landlord obligations. I'd familiarized myself with every clause in David and Cassandra's lease agreement until I could recite the terms from memory. I'd learned the difference between illegal retaliation and legitimate business decisions, between personal vendettas and professional property management. Mrs. Kelly had become an invaluable ally, though she didn't fully understand why I was so intensely interested in the details of managing one particular unit. Through our weekly calls, I'd learned more about my son and daughter-in-law's behavior as tenants than I'd known about them as family members in the past year. They called again yesterday, she reported during our October 15th conversation. Mrs. Whitfield is insisting we install new kitchen appliances because she claims the current ones are substandard for the rental price. When I explained that the appliances are only 3 years old and functioning perfectly, she demanded to speak to the owner directly. I smiled, imagining Cassandra's frustration at being denied access to someone she assumed she could charm or intimidate into giving her what she wanted. What did you tell her? That the owner prefers to handle all communications through our management company. She wasn't pleased. She actually said, and I quote, "I need to speak to someone who understands the value of quality tenants." I found that rather presumptuous, considering they've been nothing but trouble since they moved in. Quality tenants. Cassandra considered herself and David quality tenants, while simultaneously complaining about every aspect of the property, demanding special accommodations, and organizing other tenants to protest their rent. It was exactly the kind of entitled behavior I'd watched her exhibit in other areas of her life, but now it was my property she was treating like her personal kingdom to renovate according to her preferences. Has there been any other activity from Unit 847C, I asked. Actually, yes. Mr. Whitfield submitted a maintenance request claiming the water pressure in their master bathroom shower is inadequate. Our plumber checked it twice and found nothing wrong. The pressure is actually above average for the neighborhood. But Mr. Whitfield insists we install a new showerhead system, apparently something his wife saw in a magazine. David was enabling Cassandra's demands, just as he'd enabled her decision to exile me from their lives. He'd become the kind of man who submitted false maintenance requests to satisfy his wife's desire for luxury upgrades on someone else's dime. The son I'd raised to be honest and respectful had learned to lie to service workers and manipulate systems to get what his wife wanted. There's something else, Mrs. Kelly continued. Mrs. Whitfield has been asking questions about the other tenants' rent amounts. She seems to believe she's paying more than everyone else, which isn't true. All the units are priced according to size and location within the building. But she's convinced there's some kind of inequity. Of course, Cassandra assumed she was being treated unfairly. In her worldview, she was the victim of every situation that didn't bend to her will. She'd convinced David that his mother was the burden, that the senior living facility was the solution, that their lives would be perfect once they eliminated the inconvenience of family obligations. Now she was convinced that her landlord was the problem, that her rent was unfair, that she deserved better treatment simply because she existed. Mrs. Kelly, I want to ask you about something delicate, I said. When we send the non-renewal notice, is there any way to include language about their complaints and demands? I want them to understand that being a tenant involves more than just paying rent on time. We typically keep non-renewal notices fairly brief and neutral, she replied. But as the property owner, you have the right to include additional information if you feel it's relevant. What specifically did you want to mention? I'd been thinking about this for weeks, crafting the perfect language to make my point without crossing any legal lines. I want them to understand that their pattern of unreasonable demands, false maintenance claims, and attempts to organize tenant dissatisfaction have made them unsuitable for lease renewal. I want it clear that their behavior, not their rent payment history, is the reason they're being asked to leave. That's completely within your rights as a property owner, Mrs. Kelly confirmed. Tenants who create disruption and make excessive demands can absolutely be considered for non-renewal on those grounds. Should I draft something for your review? Actually, I'd like to write the letter myself. I want the language to be very specific about their behavior and very clear about the consequences of treating rental property like a personal renovation project. After ending the call, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten countless lonely meals, where I'd stared at my silent phone hoping David would call, and began drafting the non-renewal notice. Each word was chosen carefully, each sentence designed to maximize impact while remaining legally sound. The letter began with standard notification language about lease expiration and non-renewal, but then it detailed every complaint, every false maintenance request, every demand for special treatment that David and Cassandra had made over the past year. I documented their attempts to organize other tenants, their claims that appliances needed replacing when they functioned perfectly, their insistence that rent rates were unfair despite living in a premium location. But the final paragraph was where I allowed myself to be personal within professional bounds. Property ownership requires tenants who appreciate the value of what they're renting and who understand that their lease grants them residency, not renovation rights. Tenants who consistently demonstrate dissatisfaction with the property, make unreasonable demands for upgrades and modifications, and attempt to organize opposition to established rental rates are not compatible with our property management philosophy. This non-renewal is based entirely on your documented behavior as tenants, not your payment history, which has been satisfactory. I read the letter a dozen times, editing and refining until every sentence accomplished exactly what I intended. The message was clear. Their behavior had consequences, their demands had been noticed, and their assumption that they could treat the property as their personal kingdom had been a costly mistake. But the letter was only part of my strategy. I'd also been researching the rental market in Riverside Heights, and I discovered that similar properties were now renting for significantly more than what David and Cassandra were paying. Harold Brennan had been charging below market rates, probably out of kindness to his tenants. But kindness was a luxury I could no longer afford where my son and his wife were concerned. If they wanted to stay in the neighborhood, if David wanted to avoid the disruption of moving, if Cassandra wanted to maintain her address in the most prestigious area of the city, they'd need to find a new rental. And every comparable property would cost them at least $1,500 more per month than they were currently paying. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. The woman they'd tried to exile to save money on their living expenses had just created a situation where their living expenses were about to increase dramatically. The son who'd worried about my financial drain on his resources was about to discover what a real financial drain looked like. On October 30th, the day before I planned to deliver the non-renewal notice, I drove past their townhouse for the first time since learning I owned it. The unit was well maintained, with the kind of landscaping and exterior updates that justified premium rent. David's car sat in the driveway, Cassandra's luxury sedan parked beside it. Through the large front windows, I could see the expensive furniture they'd bought for their perfect life, the life they'd decided had no room for me. Tomorrow I would knock on that door and hand them a letter that would change everything. Tomorrow they would discover that the burden they'd discarded was now the landlord they'd been complaining about. Tomorrow, the woman they'd tried to manage out of their lives would begin managing them out of their home. But tonight I sat in my apartment, the temporary home that had become the base of operations for my new life, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not for their suffering, but for their understanding that some people can't be discarded without consequences. The countdown was over. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. I woke at 5:30 on October 31st. Not from an alarm, but from the sharp clarity that comes when your body knows something important is about to happen. For months, I'd been waking to emptiness, to days that stretched ahead with no purpose beyond filling time until bedtime came again. But this morning carried weight, significance, the promise of a conversation that would redefine everything. I dressed carefully, choosing the charcoal blazer I'd bought specifically for this moment, professional, authoritative, the kind of outfit that commanded respect rather than requesting it. In the mirror, I saw a woman I was still getting used to. Composed, purposeful, no longer apologizing for taking up space in the world. My hands were steady as I applied makeup, as I styled my hair, as I gathered the documents that would change my son's life. The manila envelope contained the non-renewal notice, formal and legally precise, along with copies of every maintenance request, every complaint, every demand that David and Cassandra had made over the past year. Mrs. Kelly had been thorough in her documentation, and the pattern of entitled behavior was impossible to ignore when laid out chronologically. But tucked beneath the official papers was something else, a personal letter I'd written the night before, words I'd needed to say for months but hadn't had the power to deliver until now. I arrived at the Riverside Heights complex at exactly 10 o'clock, when most people would be settled into their Thursday morning routines. David would be at work, I knew, but Cassandra's real estate schedule was more flexible. According to Mrs. Kelly, she often worked from home on Thursdays, making calls and scheduling appointments from the luxury of the townhouse she'd been so vocal about improving. The complex was even more beautiful than I'd remembered from my brief reconnaissance drive. Mature oak trees lined the sidewalks, their October leaves creating a carpet of gold and amber. The townhouses were uniformly elegant, with small front gardens and architectural details that justified the premium rent. It was exactly the kind of place a successful young couple would want to live. Exactly the kind of address that would impress Cassandra's real estate clients and social media followers. Unit 847C sat in the middle of the row, distinguished by the elaborate seasonal decorations Cassandra had arranged on the front steps. Pumpkins, decorative corn, and autumn wreaths created a display that belonged in a magazine spread about sophisticated holiday entertaining. Even her Halloween decorations were perfectly curated, designed to project an image of domestic perfection and refined taste. I stood at the bottom of their front steps for a moment, remembering the last time I'd approached this door. 8 months ago, I'd climbed these same steps as Eleanor the burden, Eleanor the problem to be solved, Eleanor the mother who'd been gently but firmly excluded from her son's new life. Today, I was climbing them as Eleanor the landlord, Eleanor the decision-maker, Eleanor the woman who controlled whether they'd be able to keep their perfect address and their carefully curated lifestyle. My knock was firm, professional, the kind of knock that announced business rather than a social call. Through the frosted glass panels beside the door, I could see movement, could hear the click of heels against hardwood floors. Cassandra was home, and she was coming to answer the door to a conversation she had no idea was coming. When the door opened, Cassandra's expression went through a fascinating evolution. First, surprise. She clearly hadn't been expecting anyone. Then confusion, as she tried to process why I was standing on her doorstep dressed like a businesswoman, rather than like the defeated mother she'd last seen. Finally, a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The kind of expression people wear when they're trying to be polite to someone they'd prefer never to see again. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected. What are you doing here?" "I'm here on business, Mrs. Whitfield," I replied, deliberately using her married name rather than the familiar tone she might have expected from her former mother-in-law. "May I come in? There are some documents I need to deliver personally." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable but unable to think of a polite way to refuse. "I suppose, yes, come in, though I'm not sure what kind of business you could have with us." The interior of the townhouse was exactly as I'd imagined, all clean lines and neutral colors, expensive furniture arranged for maximum visual impact, every surface clear of the kind of personal clutter that makes a house feel like a home. It was beautiful in the way model homes are beautiful, perfect and cold, and designed to impress rather than comfort. Cassandra led me to the living room, her posture tense, her movements careful. She was wearing what she probably considered casual clothes, yoga pants that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a cashmere sweater that hung perfectly on her thin frame, jewelry that caught the light from the large windows. Even at home on a Thursday morning, she looked like she was posing for a lifestyle blog. "Please, sit down," she said, gesturing to one of the gray leather chairs that faced the matching sofa. "Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "This won't take long," I said, remaining standing and opening the manila envelope. "I'm here to deliver notice regarding your lease." Her expression shifted from polite confusion to sharp attention. "Our lease? I don't understand. Are you working for the property management company now? Because if this is about our maintenance requests, I want you to know that we have every right to expect our living conditions to meet reasonable standards." I pulled out the official non-renewal notice and handed it to her. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm here as the owner of this property. Your lease expires on December 31st, and it will not be renewed." She stared at the document for a long moment, her eyes scanning the formal language, her face growing paler as she processed what she was reading. "Owner of the property? That's impossible. You live in some tiny apartment, you don't own anything." "I own this building," I said calmly. "I own your townhouse, and I own every other unit in this complex. And based on your behavior as tenants over the past year, I've decided not to offer you a lease renewal." Cassandra sank onto the sofa, still clutching the notice, her perfectly composed facade beginning to crack. "This has to be some kind of mistake. You can't just... You don't have the authority to..." "I have every authority," I interrupted, pulling out the second set of documents. "Here's a copy of the property deed with my name on it. Here are copies of every complaint you've made to the management company, every unreasonable demand for upgrades and modifications, every false maintenance request you've submitted. Your pattern of behavior as tenants has been thoroughly documented." She was reading now, her eyes darting between the lease notice and the complaint documentation, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen from her before. Shock, confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "But you're David's mother. You're nobody. You don't have money for something like this." "I'm Harold Brennan's daughter," I said quietly. "He left me this property when he died." He also left me enough money to maintain it properly and enough authority to choose who deserves to live here. Harold Brennan? She looked up sharply. The developer? That's impossible. It's entirely possible, and it's entirely true. I pulled out the final document, my personal letter. This is for you and David to read together. It explains exactly why you're being asked to leave and exactly what led to this decision. Cassandra took the letter with shaking hands. Eleanor, I think there's been some misunderstanding. If this is about our family situation, about what happened between us, surely we can work something out. You can't just kick us out because of personal issues. This isn't personal, I said, though we both knew it was deeply personal. This is business. You've been problem tenants from the beginning. You've made unreasonable demands, submitted false maintenance requests, and tried to organize other tenants against the management company. Those are legitimate business reasons for non-renewal. We pay our rent on time, she said desperately. We've never been late once. Paying rent on time is the minimum requirement for being a tenant, not the maximum. Your lease expires in 60 days. I suggest you start looking for alternative housing. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and Mrs. Whitfield? When you're apartment hunting, you should know that comparable properties in this neighborhood are renting for at least $6,000 per month now. You've been getting quite a good deal here. As I walked back to my car, I could hear Cassandra's voice through the thin walls, sharp and panicked, making a phone call that could only be to David. By the time I reached the street, she was shouting about lawyers and rights and how this couldn't be legal. But it was entirely legal. More than legal, it was justice, served quietly and professionally, without shouting or threats or dramatic confrontations. I'd simply knocked on their door, delivered factual information about their housing situation, and left them to deal with the consequences of their own behavior. The drive home felt different than any drive I'd taken in months. Not triumphant, exactly, but purposeful. I wasn't the woman who'd been dismissed from this same address 8 months ago. I wasn't the burden who'd been managed out of their lives for their convenience. I was Eleanor Brennan Whitfield, property owner, decision-maker, the woman who'd just reminded 2 people that some discarded things have more power than the people who threw them away. My phone rang twice during the drive home, David's number flashing on the screen both times. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever he had to say could wait until he'd had time to fully understand what had just happened to his perfectly planned life. The real conversation would come later, when the shock wore off and the reality set in. For now, it was enough to know that they finally understood who they'd been dealing with all along. David's first call came 47 minutes after I left their townhouse. I was sitting in my apartment, having changed from my business attire into comfortable clothes, when my phone buzzed with his name on the screen. I let it ring through to voicemail, then listened to the message while making myself a cup of tea. Mom, it's David. Cassandra called me at work, and she's upset about something involving you and our lease. She's not making much sense. Something about you owning our building? I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Can you please call me back so we can sort this out? His voice carried the tone of a man who assumed he was dealing with a confused elderly woman who'd gotten herself mixed up in something beyond her understanding. There was no anger yet, just the patient exasperation of someone preparing to clean up what he assumed was his mother's mistake. The second call came an hour later, after he'd presumably gone home and seen the documents I'd left with Cassandra. This voicemail was different, sharper, more urgent, with an edge of disbelief that told me the reality was beginning to sink in. Mom, I need you to call me back immediately. We need to talk about this lease situation. If what Cassandra is saying is true, if you actually think you own our building, then we need to discuss this like adults. There has to be some kind of explanation, some way to resolve this misunderstanding. Still, he was framing it as a misunderstanding, as something that could be resolved through conversation and reasonable adult discussion. He hadn't yet grasped that this wasn't a mistake or confusion. It was a deliberate, calculated business decision made by a woman who'd been underestimated for the last time. I waited until Friday evening to return his call. 24 hours of silence. 24 hours for them to research Harold Brennan, to verify the property records, to understand that their worst nightmare was actually their new reality. When I finally dialed David's number, I was ready for whatever version of my son would answer the phone. Mom. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it used to sound when he was a teenager trying not to lose his temper about some perceived injustice. We need to talk. Hello, David, I said calmly. I assume you've had time to review the documents I delivered to your wife yesterday. Your wife, not Cassandra. The formality was deliberate, a signal that we were no longer speaking as family members but as landlord and tenant. Is it true? He asked without preamble. Do you actually own our building? I own the property at 847 Riverside Heights Boulevard, yes. I inherited it from my biological father, Harold Brennan, when he passed away earlier this year. Your unit is part of that property. Silence stretched between us, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to address directly. Why didn't you tell us? He finally asked. Why let us go on paying rent to you without knowing it? Because I only learned about the inheritance 2 months ago, I replied. And because when I did learn about it, I thought carefully about what kind of landlord I wanted to be and what kind of tenants I was willing to work with. Mom, this is insane. You can't just kick us out because you're angry about what happened between us. I'm not kicking you out because I'm angry, David. I'm declining to renew your lease because you and your wife have been problem tenants. The property management company has documented every unreasonable demand, every false maintenance request, every complaint you've made about perfectly functional appliances and appropriate rental rates. Those weren't false requests, he said, his voice rising slightly. The shower pressure really was low, and the appliances are older than what we should have for what we're paying. The shower pressure tested above average for the neighborhood, and the appliances are 3 years old and functioning perfectly. You submitted those requests because your wife wanted upgrades that weren't covered by your lease, not because there were actual problems. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear Cassandra's voice in the background, sharp and agitated, though I couldn't make out her words. Okay, David said finally, maybe we were particular about some things. But Mom, we're family. Surely that counts for something. Surely we can work this out. Family. I let the word hang in the air between us. Is that what you thought we were when you presented me with brochures for senior living facilities? When you told me I was affecting your marriage? When you decided that managing my life was too much trouble for your perfect relationship? That was different, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were trying to help you. We thought you'd be happier around people your own age. You thought you'd be happier without me around, I corrected. You thought your life would be simpler if you could hand me off to professionals and visit me occasionally when it was convenient. You thought I was a burden you could manage away. That's not, he started, then stopped. Mom, even if we made mistakes, even if we handled things badly, you can't destroy our lives over it. Destroy your lives? I kept my voice level, professional. I'm simply declining to renew a lease with problem tenants. You'll find another place to live. There are plenty of rental properties available, though they'll cost considerably more than what you've been paying here. Cassandra's voice grew louder in the background, and I heard David say, "Hold on," before speaking to me again. Cassandra wants to talk to you. I don't have anything to discuss with Mrs. Whitfield that I didn't already cover in yesterday's meeting. Mom, please, just listen to what she has to say. Against my better judgment, I waited while the phone changed hands. Eleanor, Cassandra's voice was strained, lacking her usual confident polish. I think we need to clear the air about some things. There have been misunderstandings on both sides, and I'd like the chance to apologize for any hurt feelings. Hurt feelings, I repeated. Is that what you think this is about? I know you're angry about the senior living suggestion, she continued, and I understand that it felt like rejection. But Eleanor, you have to understand our position. We're newlyweds trying to start our lives together, and having family live so close. being so involved in our daily decisions. It was putting strain on our marriage. So you decided the solution was to put me somewhere you could visit when it was convenient and ignore when it wasn't. We thought it would be better for everyone, she said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she'd used to convince David the first was the problem. You'd have friends your own age, activities designed for your interests, support when you needed it. We'd still be family, just with healthier boundaries. Healthier boundaries, I said. Like the healthy boundary between landlord and tenant that you've been violating for months with your constant demands and complaints? That's completely different, she snapped, her composure finally cracking. Those were legitimate concerns about the property we're paying to live in. No, Mrs. Whitfield. Those were demands from someone who thinks the world should accommodate her preferences, regardless of contracts, lease terms, or basic courtesy to service workers. You've treated my property the same way you treated me, like something that exists for your convenience and should change to meet your standards. Your property, she said, and I could hear the disbelief still coloring her voice. I still can't believe you actually own this place. Where did you get the money? How is any of this even possible? I inherited it from my father, I said simply. The father I never knew I had, who watched my life from a distance and made arrangements to ensure I'd never be powerless. He understood something you never did, that taking care of people you love isn't a burden, it's a privilege. Eleanor, please. David's voice came back on the line. Can we meet in person? Can we sit down and talk about this rationally? There has to be some way to work this out. The time for working things out was 8 months ago, when you could have chosen to include me in your lives instead of managing me out of them. The time for rational discussion was when you could have treated me like family instead of like a problem to be solved. But we can fix this, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. We can make things right between us. We can be a family again. You can be the kind of family you choose to be, I said, but you can't be tenants in my building. Your lease expires December 31st, and it will not be renewed. That decision is final and non-negotiable. Mom, please. My name is on the deed, David. My signature is on the non-renewal notice. My decision controls whether you get to keep your perfect address and your carefully curated lifestyle. For the first time in 8 months, I'm not the one begging for consideration. I hung up before he could respond, before he could make promises about changing or plead for another chance, or try to negotiate terms for staying. The conversation was over, the power dynamic was clear, and the lesson was delivered. They would spend the next 60 days learning what it felt like to be at someone else's mercy, to have their future determined by someone who'd decided they were more trouble than they were worth. They would discover how it felt to be managed out of a situation by someone who held all the cards. And for the first time since Thomas died, for the first time since my son chose his wife over his mother, I felt like myself again. Not Eleanor the burden, not Eleanor the problem to be solved, but Eleanor the decision-maker, Eleanor the woman who owned something they needed and had the power to say no. The student had become the teacher, and class was officially in session. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crisp silence that makes the world feel newly made. I woke in my apartment, still temporary, still small, but no longer a prison, and made coffee in the quiet kitchen where I'd spent so many months grieving not just Thomas, but the family I thought I'd had. The calendar on my wall showed December 25th, and in 6 days, David and Cassandra's lease would expire forever. They'd tried everything in the past 8 weeks. First came the lawyers. 3 different attorneys had called Mrs. Kelly, demanding documentation, threatening legal action, insisting that family relationships created special obligations in landlord-tenant law. Each lawyer eventually reached the same conclusion. I'd followed every legal requirement perfectly, documented every legitimate business reason for non-renewal, and operated entirely within my rights as a property owner. The last attorney had actually apologized for wasting our time, explaining to David that pursuing the matter further would only result in expensive legal fees with no chance of success. Then came the attempts at reconciliation. David showed up at my apartment twice in November, standing in the hallway with flowers and apologies, begging for the chance to, quote, work things out as a family. I'd listened through the door as he promised to make things right, to include me in their lives, to treat me with the respect I deserved. But his promises felt hollow now, motivated by desperation rather than genuine remorse. He wasn't sorry for how they'd treated me. He was sorry it had consequences. Cassandra had tried a different approach, sending carefully crafted emails about family healing and moving forward together. She'd researched my charitable donations. Harold Brennan's foundation work had been well documented in the local papers, and suddenly discovered shared interests in community service and philanthropy. Her messages were masterpieces of manipulation, designed to appeal to my supposed desire for family connection while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused. But the most telling moment had come 3 weeks ago, when they'd invited me to Thanksgiving dinner. The invitation arrived on elegant cardstock, Cassandra's perfect handwriting requesting the pleasure of my company for a family celebration. It was exactly the kind of invitation I'd dreamed of receiving for months, the acknowledgement of my place in their lives that I desperately wanted. And because I'd wanted it so badly for so long, I knew it was meaningless now. They weren't inviting Eleanor, the beloved mother. They were inviting Eleanor, the landlord, hoping to charm their way into a lease renewal. I'd sent a polite decline, suggesting they use the time to focus on their apartment hunting, since suitable properties in their price range were becoming increasingly scarce as the holidays approached. Because they were struggling to find housing, exactly as I'd predicted, the rental market in Riverside Heights had grown even more competitive since October, with comparable properties now listing for $7,000 per month or more. Properties in less desirable neighborhoods, the kind of places David and Cassandra would consider beneath their social status, were still expensive enough to strain their budget significantly. Mrs. Kelly had kept me informed of their increasingly frantic inquiries. They'd contacted her a dozen times, offering to sign a new lease at higher rent, proposing payment of all past complaints through community service, even suggesting they'd accept a month-to-month arrangement while they continued searching. Each offer had been politely declined, with Mrs. Kelly explaining that the property owner had made a final decision about their suitability as tenants. They seemed genuinely shocked that money can't solve this problem, she'd told me during our last conversation. Mrs. Whitfield actually asked if there was an amount you'd accept to change your mind. When I explained that some decisions aren't financial, she seemed not to understand the concept. Of course, Cassandra didn't understand. In her world, every problem had a price. Every person had terms they'd accept. Every situation could be managed through the right combination of money and manipulation. She'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved by throwing resources at it, or a person who couldn't be convinced to compromise their principles for the right offer. But I'd learned something important over these past months. Power isn't about having money or owning property or controlling other people's housing situations. Real power is about knowing your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve, regardless of what anyone else thinks you should settle for. On December 30th, Mrs. Kelly called with a final update. They've submitted a written request for a lease extension, she reported. Just 1 month, they say, to give them time to finalize arrangements on a property they claim to have found. Mr. Whitfield wrote a personal letter asking for compassion during the holiday season. What did you tell them? That lease terms are non-negotiable and their occupancy must end by midnight on December 31st, as specified in the original notice. They've scheduled movers for tomorrow morning. Tomorrow. After 8 months of learning what it felt like to be powerless, they were finally experiencing the reality of consequences. Tomorrow, they would pack their carefully curated possessions and leave the address that had been so important to their self-image. Tomorrow, they would move to whatever compromise housing they'd managed to find, paying significantly more for significantly less than what they'd had in my building. But the real resolution had come 2 weeks earlier, in a conversation I'd never expected to have. David had called on a Tuesday evening, not to negotiate or plead, but simply to talk. His voice was different, quieter, older somehow, stripped of the confident entitlement that had characterized our relationship since his marriage. "Mom," he'd said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without hanging up." I'd listened. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the difference between taking care of people and seeing them as burdens. And I've been remembering things I forgot or maybe didn't want to see." His voice cracked slightly. "I remember you driving me to soccer practice every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years, even though you hate driving in traffic. I remember you learning to play chess just so you'd have something to do with me when I was going through that phase in middle school. I remember you working extra hours at the church fundraiser to pay for my senior trip when Dad's hours got cut." He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. "I remember 100 things you did because you loved me, not because you had to. And when you needed me to do the same thing, to love you because you're my mother, not because it was convenient, I failed. We failed." I'd waited, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "I know it's too late to fix this. I know you won't change your mind about the lease, and honestly, I understand why. We earned this. But I needed you to know that I remember who you really are, and I'm ashamed of how we treated the woman who taught me everything good I know about loyalty and love." "David," I'd said finally, "remembering isn't the same as learning." "I know, but it's a start." "Maybe," I'd agreed, "maybe it is." We'd talked for another hour that night, not about leases or housing or business, but about memories and mistakes, and the difference between loving someone and letting them love you. It wasn't reconciliation, exactly, but it was recognition. Recognition that we'd both lost something important, that families could break in ways that might never heal completely, but that understanding the damage was still valuable. Now, on Christmas morning, I made my coffee and sat by the window watching the sunrise over a city where I finally felt at home. Not because I owned property or controlled other people's lives, but because I'd remembered who Eleanor Whitfield really was beneath all the roles I'd played for other people. At noon, I drove to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. I brought flowers, not the obligatory arrangements I'd left during the depths of my grief, but bright yellow daffodils that promised spring would come again. I told him about Harold Brennan, about the inheritance, about learning that some gifts come from unexpected places. I told him about David's phone call and the possibility that understanding, if not forgiveness, might be enough to build something new on. "I'm not the woman you married," I said aloud, arranging the flowers on his grave, "but I'm not the woman they tried to discard either. I'm someone new, someone stronger, someone who finally knows the difference between being needed and being valued." That evening, I started planning, not for revenge or justice, those debts had been paid, but for the life I wanted to build with the power I'd discovered and the wisdom I'd earned. Harold Brennan had given me more than property and money. He'd given me the chance to become the kind of person who couldn't be thrown away by anyone ever again. The woman who'd once begged for a place at her son's table was gone forever. In her place stood Eleanor Brennan Whitfield, property owner, decision-maker, and keeper of her own worth. The woman who'd finally learned that the most important family you can have is the family you create with yourself, based on respect, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that you matter. Tomorrow would bring new tenants to Unit 847C, people who would appreciate what they had and treat it with respect. David and Cassandra would begin their new life in their new home, hopefully wiser for the experience of learning that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt simply because you need them again. And I would continue becoming whoever Eleanor Whitfield was meant to be when no one else was trying to define her. The end was also the beginning, and I was finally ready for both. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.